As our study of United Church history this term draws to a close, my hope is that some things have become clearer for you and other things may have become murkier. Historic events, as we've seen, do not occur outside of a context. Around any historical event we care to name, there is a swirling mass of different emphases, forces, interests, and so on. Nothing historical is ever just about the event we choose to focus on. However, determining which contextual factors lead to specific historic results can be difficult to the point of impossibility. So, what we do is we try and reach informed opinions on what seemed most important to the actors involved and what seems most important to us. But we recognize that those are not necessarily the same. Although many people imagine that they can reach into history for accurate conclusions to guide contemporary thoughts and actions, that is a very real challenge. The past does not exist solely to drive or inform the present. You may recall, for instance, when we talked about the church in the post-World War II context, we identified a period of church life that presented a really aberrant image of church growth in the time frame that had led up to it and in the period after that moment ended. But we also argued that the influence of that period is still very real and very potent in the life of the church today. So whether it was a historic anomaly or not, we need to take cognizance of it. I wonder if you can think of instances in your experience or in the congregation you know best where that is true. Where do the experiences of post-war church life continue to have an impact on your community of faith? Could it be in the size and shape of the building? Could it be in the memories of the participants? Could it be in the unspoken expectations of what church should do and should be? All of those are based on an era which, at one and the same time, can be clearly identified as a historical anomaly and normative for many who came up. And so the question arises for church leaders, how do we respond to that sort of influence in a healthy fashion and inappropriate uses of history? As students of history, and particularly when we're talking about relatively recent history, we can often say very confidently, this event did occur. So what we're focusing on is not lost in the dim mists of storytelling. These things happened. Now, depending on the subject and the time frame, we might also be able to say that these were some of the longer-term results. For instance, with the Indian residential, to identify both the immediate impacts and some of the longer-term generational trauma. So that's the what happened. But we need to be much more circumspect in saying why something occurs, and even more so, what does it mean? In other words, what lessons might we draw if we chose? Because both the why question and the meaning question involved elements that are spiritual and religious, but also economic, political, social, and demographic, and so on. Again, using the residential institutions as an example, we saw that there was a mixture of motives. For some, the goal was racist and, quite frankly, genocidal. For others, the institutions embodied a clear intention to fulfill the Christian's call to serve the other person. In this case, it was helping move an entire race of people to a place of involvement in a modern nation and its economy. For the first group, the institutions came perilously close to succeeding in what they, latter group, the unintended consequences undermined many of their good intentions. And that, of course, is another part of the historical story. There are intended consequences and unintended consequences. And when we're talking about a particular event, we need to be careful to distinguish the two. We can talk about what people intended as the consequences. We can also talk about what they should have been aware might have happened. But there are always things that we have no idea as clearly as we can. We then enter into our assessment of the multiple aspects of the event, assign more weight. Historians, if they are wise, do not attempt to predict the future. Nations, people, institutions like churches, they are free to behave in often unpredictable ways as they respond to forces that are largely unseen. And they are also free to behave in ways that are not necessarily either rational or in their best interests. Let's take the COVID-19 pandemic and its massive implications in so many areas of life as an example. Yes, epidemiologists and futurists could and did predict that at some point, somehow, a worldwide epidemic was likely. And based on that evidence, they said that there were precautions that might be taken and preparations that could be entered into. They could even predict the scope of the challenges that the society might encounter. However, predicting the exact timing, the pattern of spread, the responses of authorities and individuals is largely impossible, or it leads to so many variations that it's virtually useless. So that's one argument against prediction. On the other hand, history certainly shows us trend lines, and we know that it is highly unusual for institutions, nations, and individuals to change their fundamental behavior in the absence of strong and often unpredictable influence. So, for instance, we know that if you take a vulnerable population and put them in the charge of a group of people who have absolute control over their lives, who have very little or very little effectual oversight, the results are not going to be good. We know that. So, as historians, we can say that given these patterns, these results are more likely to play out than those results. So it's a degree of prediction, but not a particularly strong degree. So, for instance, in the United Church, it is highly unlikely that the literal interpretation of Scripture is going to become a doctrinal norm to which all clergy will have to subscribe. There's nothing in the trend lines of the United Church of Canada to say that that is a likely scenario. It is also unlikely that United Church congregations will cease to be involved in working to address the concerns and needs of their neighbors, even though that involvement may shift quite radically depending on a whole variety of circumstances which are beyond the capacity of the historian to predict. So, I don't want you to try and predict the future, but on the basis of what we've learned together, we can draw some probable or likely lines of development into the 21st century. Now, we're about a quarter of the way through the century, so we have more evidence to see the accuracy of our thoughts. If we think of the church since 2003, which is where that final chapter in Schweitzer's history left off, what are some of the trends that we might identify? I gave you 2 or 3 readings that tried to do some of that. So, what trends? In the article that I wrote, I identified what I consider to be the diminishing participatory nature of church governance. I traced the developments from the early days when there was so much consultation to today, when the General Council executive has ceased to be representative. That is one of the factors we might identify in speaking of the disconnection between the local church and the national body. So, without any implication of malicious intent, we can see how a series of steps in the same direction have a particular result. I also think that we will continue to see an increasing degree of congregational autonomy. This shouldn't be confused with congregationalism, at least not as our founders understood the term. As structures of consultation, oversight, and mutuality shrink and fray, generally under the pressure of scarcer and scarcer human and financial resources, the predictable result is that local communities are going to feel and to be freer and freer to do as they think best. The change into the regional structure is already having observable impacts in terms of isolation of clergy and an increase in congregational activity which are outside of our polity. It appears that the role of the region will increasingly be to put out fires and to read the Riot Act unless there is some new push, which is currently not identifiable, to help regions take on a more creative and future-oriented role. Again, these are observations based on trends. How those trends are experienced in any given set of circumstances will vary. For some congregations, the growing autonomy will be something that they welcome. For others, it will be seen as an increase in an already diminishing lack of support, and they will feel like they are floundering all by themselves and perhaps succumb to despair. But these are observations based on trends. My personal feelings about whether these are good or ill can be separated from my work as a historian. John Young, in his article, refers us back to the evangelical liberal roots of the United Church of Canada. That sense of having a compelling message to convey, along with a conviction that the freedom of the individual's choices and actions were important, not just to us, but to God. And that faith, even the most ardent of faith, can live in mutually respectful cooperation with science, for example, and with other faith traditions. So, that liberal evangelicalism would be characterized by a recognition of the need for personal regeneration, walking in tandem with more liberal studies such as sociology and political science and economics and the rest. A sense of sin as both individual and collective. Sin is also found in social structures. a welcoming of the higher criticism of the Bible over a naive literalism, a combining of the historic doctrines of the Church with the experiential religion of the Christian believer, and a tying of evangelism, the sharing of the good news, and social service. And if you think about it, you can see all of those factors and trends visible at different points and with different levels of intensity. So, where do you see examples of those characteristics in our study of history and in the church today? You may recall that when we spoke of the founding of the United Church, we spoke of a founding for a purpose, the purpose of mission. Mission in the expanding west of the country and in the industrializing cities of the east. So it was a mission that was defined in particular and in some sense narrow ways. However, when that purpose seems to have ended, where does the church find a new purpose? And if we are purpose-driven, because our ancestors were not overly concerned about defining the nature of the church apart from purpose, if we are purpose-driven and that purpose seems to have ended, then what do we do? One of the reasons so many congregations struggle is because they have no real purpose now beyond continuing to exist, or at least no real purpose that they've been able to identify. Of course, our language and practice of mission has evolved over the decades, from something we did for them because they needed what we had to the language of partnership. And whether it was mission work overseas or home missions, as they were called, the attitude was the same. It was a hierarchical attitude. Those doing the mission had things that those receiving the mission needed and could not, apparently, provide for themselves. So mission has evolved from providing basic necessities of food and medication and education to issues of justice and freedom. In the earlier days, mission was often done somewhere else by someone else. Folk we might label. The job of those who were in the pews back home was to support that with their prayers and their money. Now, I would argue that the need globally has certainly not abated. We are increasingly conscious that the mission field begins at the church door. And so that means that individual disciples and church members are being called into roles that were not anticipated and for which they may feel ill-equipped. And so the question comes, how do we draw from our rich history to inform a new way of being? What do you think? The statistical evidence is certainly gut-wrenching from the perspective of a founding vision of a church for the entire nation. And as we have studied the century, we've identified a number of factors. One was the rise of secularism, the conviction that religious institutions and their teachings are not required for the living of a full and moral life. And that may or may not be combined with overt hostility or simple indifference to such institutions. We can then ask what has contributed to the rise of secularism and the numerical decline of traditions like ours. There, the answers become much less clear and multivariate. Some would say It is the absence of clarity around issues of doctrine. If we were firmer about what we believed, then we wouldn't be in decline. Is it a failure to enforce moral and spiritual standards, the laissez faire nature of our society, as some critics would have it? Is it the lack of a compelling message? Is it a sign of weakness to make room for critical thinking, for acceptance of science, ecumenism, and freedom of belief? If we were firm in the idea that Jesus is the only way, and we didn't hesitate to say that to everybody we encountered, would we be stronger? Some clearly believe that. Is it an absence of adequate programming? So we don't provide enough to meet the needs of people? Is it a lack of outreach specifically focused on the neighbor? Despite the presence of soup kitchens and food banks, have we ignored that focuses inward rather than outward? Is it a straight out lack of evangelism or a discomfort with, quote, marketing the church, end of quotation? Each of those questions, and all of them have been raised as assertions across the decades, each of those questions also presumes an answer, although the answers may vary. So, what do the trends we've explored suggest we might focus on moving forward? And this is my interpretation. And I'm owning that, and you're free to agree or disagree and reach other conclusions. That's what historians do. In interfaith relations, we have fairly effectively, I think, laid to rest the conviction of our founders that Jesus Christ is the only pathway to God, which opens a door for more than superficial conversation. It allows for interfaith action on matters of mutual concern in the community without suspicion of the spiritual motives of our neighbors. We can work together on a whole raft of issues that threaten the quality of life in our community. We can work on those together without having to get into the very important conversation of our faith. So, for instance, when my Sikh neighbor and I work together to clean up a local park, our religious traditions aren't at the forefront. But that working together may create a relationship within which fruitful conversation might occur. Another possible trend. A very real existential question for the United Church is whether or not we will continue to hold to the vision of a church for the entire nation. We saw one expression of that in the establishing of congregations across the length and breadth of the land. At one point, it was suggested that we had more franchises than Tim Hortons. Now, leaving aside whether sustaining such a network is possible, is it even desirable? And once again, we ask the question, what is the vision of church that undergirds such a goal? A third trend. Note the change that occurs when an institution is based on a series of social understandings and assumptions that no longer hold. More explicitly, we saw the United Church was born in an age of fairly rigid social assumptions which we often associate with Victorianism. Clearly held views on morality and race, on gender and status, and the assumption, the willingness to presume that there was a one-size-fits-all path to success, and it was found within the structures of capitalism. That was, if you like, baked into the worldview of the founders. And even when we talk about the social gospel folk, they are still trying to create a just form of life and work in which people can fit into a gentler, kinder capitalism. There are very few of the social gospel folks that were actively socialist or social democratic, much less communist. So there were fairly clear ideas of what success looks like. The United Church then came of age, shall we say, after the Second World War, during a period of time when large, centralized institutions were seen as the most productive way forward. They were the most effective ways of helping people to flourish. It came of age at a time when people were willing to look to the center for identities. Now, there's an interesting conjunction of events, and I'm not drawing any conclusions here. I'm just pointing out some things that occurred in the same time frame that I find really intriguing. The last year the United Church of Canada grew in numbers was in the period of Canada's intense celebration of its sense of nationhood. The Canadian Bill of Rights was adopted in 1960. The Canadian Maple Leaf National Flag was adopted in 1965. In 1967, we celebrated 100 years as a nation, and the world came to visit at Expo 67. Canadian identity was paramount. Now, if we fast forward through subsequent decades, what do we see? We see a gradual shrinking of the role of federal institutions. We see the rise and the expansion and then the contraction of provincial structures. We see a growing sense of disconnection with faraway capitals being replaced with a much greater sense of involvement in the local. If I'm right in those observations, that has an impact on a church which is self-consciously national and tied itself to national structures and institutions. The power of the government is not voluntaristic. They have the power to enforce compliance and involvement. For example, the Income Tax Act is one sample. The church, however, is primarily chosen. Unless we have created a social situation in which failure to participate, i.e., receive weekly Mass, is a greater fear than the rejection of the institution itself. And no, I'm not saying that such an attitude characterizes the Roman Catholic Church today, although it did for many generations in Quebec prior to the 1960s. But that kind of pressure to participate in the church, largely out of fear of what might happen eternally, that's been part of church life throughout history. So if we have an institution like the mainline churches in Canada that primarily relied on social pressures and norms to bring members to them, they struggle greatly when those change. So, as we conclude our course, we see that the United Church of Canada, as an instrument of God's mission, has moved through different seasons. Times of prosperity and success, times when we were very much less than our best, times of gratitude and times of repentance and remorse. Will there be a 200th anniversary? I don't know. I do know that if there is, it will look very different than it does today. Just as many of the new and emerging congregations in 2026 look very different from those in 1925. More importantly, I believe that there is an important place for the theological trajectory that the United Church of Canada has embraced. that evangelical liberalism, that openness to new and emerging sources of knowledge as a way to plumb deeper into the mysteries of God. The striving to care for the whole person, not just the soul, and for the society in which we live, not just as a vehicle of Christianity, but as a good in itself, a conviction that God has a vision for us, and we, as God's people, are working to conform both the individual and the society more and more to the shaping of God in Christ. A theology and a life that is welcoming of the newcomer and the stranger, that is courageous about areas at the divine call, that blesses a nation with a particular perspective on the divine invitation. That seems to me, at this time, to be a deeply needed gift of God in an increasingly fractured and embittered world, where the loudest voices of Christianity sound less and less like Christ all the time. But that's what I draw from the study. What are you looking forward to?